But after that book came out, people kept asking me what I knew about ayahuasca and addiction. I knew nothing. I never even heard about it. And they kept asking me. And I finally said, fuck off, I don't know anything about it, you know? Until I said, well, maybe the universe is knocking on my door for a reason here. And then somebody told me there was an opportunity to do ceremonies locally, as there are opportunities to do that. And so I did. And the very first night that I experienced ayahuasca, I got it. I just got it. I just got why it could help people who are stressed, people with addictions, people, anybody. Just the way it opens you up, opens your heart, gives you connection and insight. And so I then decided to start working with it. But again, I don't lead the ceremonies. I'm not a shaman. I just help to prepare the participants for the ceremony and help them process and integrate their experience afterwards. So what I did is I added my therapeutic skills, however they may be, to the ceremonial process. So, and the ceremonial process is run by people, at least the people I work with, who are deeply steeped in the Shipibo, Peruvian, Amazon tradition. They chant in that language. Their teacher is a Shipibo native Indian from Peru, who comes up here sometime, by the way. And I participated in ceremonies with him a few weeks ago, along with one of my sons. And so that I just simply added what I knew to what they were already doing, but it's in a certain tradition that that is being respected, and it's very respectful. Now, there are some people who lead ceremonies who will bring the ayahuasca and they'll put on CD music. No chanting, no interactive, energetic work. Well, that's another way to do it, but the way I work with it is very much with respect for that tradition. Right. Well, we've added to that is the preparation and the processing afterwards. So people used to do ceremonies. Like in the Amazon, of course, it's a different situation. People are in a village, the shaman is known to them. In fact, for a long time, people didn't take the ayahuasca, only the shaman did. And he would then read people and tell them what they needed for their healing. But there's a culture around it. Now here in the North and the West, first of all, we're much more psychologically complicated. Secondly, we don't have the cultural context for it. So we've attempted to do with these retreats to create some kind of at least a temporary context where people are not just going to a strange experience unprepared, but there's some processing before and, of course, intense processing afterwards. And that along with what the plant does is what makes it so powerful. By the way, I should say not just what the plant does. It's not like go home and drink this and you'll be fine. It really is a context, a sacred context, and I can't emphasize that too much. That the chanting that the shamans do, and the chanting is very specific. They don't just go through a playlist of songs they're going to sing that night. When they sing a particular song depends on what somebody else is going through. And they'll chant whatever is appropriate for them at that moment. Everybody else hears the chants and benefits from it, but it's very specific, so it's very spontaneous, and it's very direct, and it's very responsive to people's actual experience. And some chants will make you throw up, and other chants may give you more of a sense of peace. So it's not like here's a drug that'll do something for you. It really is a sacred thing that if it's not honored, I think people lose out a lot. We tell people all the time, this is not going to save your life, and in fact, the Buddha talked about our habit energies that are so powerful. It takes a lot to overcome them. And those habit energies are those ingrained patterns from childhood. And they're very, very powerful because they help you survive. It's so hard to get let go of them. So it takes conscious awareness and work to maintain the connection to yourself in the face of those habit energies. Now, TJ gets on stage and he shares himself with, dozens of people every night. And that's a very powerful way to do it. But of course, not everybody who does a ceremony is going to do that. But we tell everybody, you got to have some practice. Otherwise, it's just going to become a memory. And practice means daily doing something that somehow evokes something of that experience. Now, that might be meditation. It might be just 10 minutes of writing about what you experienced, even if you're doing it for the 100th time. But just putting yourself back into that state and connecting with what you saw there. If you don't do that, it does become a fading memory. As to your second question about, do you have to believe in spirits? I don't. The shamans I work with, and by the way, they wouldn't call themselves shamans. They would say they're ayahuasqueros. They're learning, But I think they are shamans. But they don't think of themselves that way. They think of a shaman as somebody much more wiser than they feel themselves to be. But they work with people, and they'll say, "And I saw a devil standing over there, and I worked really hard to get rid of that devil." And I said, "Dave, devil? What the fuck are you talking about?" I mean, they see things in the dark. And by the way, they see things in the dark. I don't. They read people's energies in the dark. They know what somebody's going through from across the room. They're trained to be that sensitive during the ceremony. And sometimes they see angels, and sometimes they see devils, and they see spirits. And I don't. And so I always interpret those phenomena in psychological terms. But I'm quite willing to allow them their interpretation. So I don't have to accept or understand that maybe someday I'll see devils, I don't know, but if I do, I do. If I don't, I don't. But I also don't have to resist their particular experience. I don't have to argue about it. I don't have to dismiss it in my mind. I just, okay, if that's how you see it, that's great, because it's certainly helping you help that person over there. So I don't think it takes that kind of belief to get benefit from the experience.
Do you have any theory as to why it has a different effect on people, even though you're drinking the same tea, and why it's different, the next night than it was the night before?
You weren't the same person the second night you did it as you were the first night. You were not the same person. And as to why, everybody's brain is different, everybody's life experience is different, everybody's physiology is different, everybody's metabolism is different in terms of how they metabolize the plant. And people are at different stages of their life. So, I mean, why would they have the same experience? It'd be unusual if they did.
But if we were all drinking whiskey, it wouldn't be quite so varied.
Well, whiskey is, they call it a spirit, don't they? People that work with alcohol and they have in spiritual ways, they might have it differently. But why do people drink whiskey? They don't do it to have a conscious, aware experience. They do it for just the opposite. So I think it depends on the intention and the context. Oh, sure. Ayahuasca is not the way to do it. There's no the way to do it. It's just one particular path, which is available to a relatively small number of people. I do retreats without ayahuasca. Now, the experience will not be as intense, but I've seen a lot of transformational experiences. In fact, people even have had spiritual experiences sometimes, very rarely. But a friend of mine leads transformational enlightenment retreats where people come to similar realizations. So there's lots of ways to get there, and the plant is just one of them. There's nothing unique about that from that point of view. And it would be wrong to think that, and actually, if people can get there without the plant, even so much the better, in a certain way. The ayahuasca is a very woody vine that wraps itself around trees. So they chop it up, and as TJ said, they mix it with another plant, and they boil it together they chop up this vine, and they boil it with another plant called chakruna, and they boil it for about 8 hours, and then you get this brew. And the shamans, when they prepare it, they certainly chant over it. Yeah, there's been no such studies, because, at least in North America, because you can't get approval for such studies, because ayahuasca is not one of these quantifiable pharmaceutical agents that you can put into a pill form and then run double-blind studies on. It just does not fit into the Western medical model. There's no way to get approval for a study using ayahuasca. I talked to Health Canada about that. I could do it if I had $3 million. So the experience, the closest I can come to it is to tell you that in Brazil, where there's a religious movement around ayahuasca called Santo Daime, they've studied those people. Psychiatrists have studied those people. And over time, there's significantly less depression, less alcoholism, less drug use amongst that population who uses the ayahuasca than in a non-ayahuasca population. So that, but I couldn't give you percentages, and there's never been a study that says, here's a bunch of alcoholics or drug addicts, let's give some of them ayahuasca, let's give some of them a placebo, and there's no such studies even theoretically possible. All I can tell you is that in my experience, there have been people Cynthia, who will be here one of these nights, would still be living in a hotel if she would still be alive, if she hadn't come to one of our ceremonies. And there are people who have healed from sexual addictions, behavior addictions, bulimia, and so on. But there's nothing scientifically that I can tell you that here's the proof. I can't tell you that. Well, first of all, I need to say that it's not for everybody, and we go through a screening process to make sure that people whom it might be inappropriate don't participate. So if you've had psychotic episodes or manic episodes, I don't want to take the responsibility of leading you through a ceremony. I would, if I could be with you for the next 3 months and really look after you afterwards. But there's not that option. So that's the first thing. You can develop an unhealthy relationship to anything. Nobody's going to get addicted to the substance. I mean, why would anybody get addicted to something that makes you puke and really doesn't make you feel good at all? I mean, there's just nothing attractive about it. And it's not that you can guarantee that, some people, if they drink, they're going to have a certain predictable experience. Nobody has a predictable experience with ayahuasca, so I don't see any addiction potential there. What can happen for some people, I would believe, is that they stop living their real lives and they start putting all their energies into having this kind of experience. There's always that potential. And there are some people who wanted to come on my retreat, sometimes repeatedly, and I kind of excluded them. I said, no, you've got to do the work in your own life. Don't rely on this experience to do it for you. So there's that risk, but it's not a huge one. I don't see it as a big risk at all, and there's many worse things in this life. So yes, there is that risk with anything, but it's not a significant factor. It's hard to know how far it goes back. There are some ancient carvings that indicate that it might have been used maybe even a couple of thousand years ago. But nobody knows for sure. As far as I know, nobody knows for sure. The original uses would not have been necessarily therapeutic ones. There's almost always plants were used in ceremonial, ritual, spiritual context to connect people more to creation and to creator, however that was conceived. So its original uses would have been more in that spiritual, ceremonial sense. And at some point, the shamans began to use it, healing. They would, the medicine men, the medicine women. Again, not necessarily the individual would take the plant, but the shaman would. And then they would guide the other person through whatever healing needed to happen. So I think the healing use is probably secondary or an offshoot, and the original use was probably a spiritual, ceremonial. Does everyone need healing in some way? Well, it's not a question of needing. I mean, you can go through life. A lot of people do. They become prime ministers, or presidents. There's never any healing in their lives, and they may die with honors and have a military funeral with millions of people, watching on television. So you can't say that they needed it. Would everyone benefit from it? In this culture, absolutely. There's nobody, not anybody I've ever met or seen on television or read about who wouldn't benefit from some. Now, that doesn't mean they have to do ayahuasca, but for some kind of a healing process to occur. Healing comes from the word for wholeness. And there are very few whole people in this society. This society does not foster whole people. It fosters broken or alienated or divided people for some of the reasons that TJ actually mentioned, and for many other reasons as well. So it's not that anybody needs it, but could anybody benefit from it? My answer would be absolutely. But you know, there's a great British psychiatrist, D.W. Winnicott, a child psychiatrist, who said that, basically, I'm paraphrasing him, but he said that two things can go wrong in childhood. One is when bad things happen that shouldn't happen. And that's the trauma, the abuse, the exploitation. But then he says, also when things don't happen that should happen. In other words, a child may not have been beaten, sexually abused, or overtly neglected. But what if he didn't get the emotional attunement, attention that he needed? What if he was a sensitive child whose emotions were never listened to? Now, people don't remember what didn't happen. People may recall what happened, but they won't recall what didn't happen. And those are the people that are really struggling at these, you know, and TJ is one of them. I mean, you know, he was not abused. He was not mistreated. Not that everything was perfect in his home, but it was mostly what didn't happen in TJ's home, I believe, that created the difficulties. And that's harder to deal with because it's not as overt, it's not as obvious.
It's like a fringe monster. It's not an obvious monster, it's more like it's on the fringe.
Yeah.
It's very appropriate to my life. And a big part of this retreat, too, was what I've come to think of as Gabor's detective work. Because someone might be there with an issue that they clearly had a handle on. This is my issue. But they had no idea where it came from, because I came from a perfect, happy home, so it couldn't be that. And then through dialoguing, different things would come out. But to the person, these would all be revelations. Like, they just had no idea that these things that they'd stopped thinking of, or just had never even considered, were part of their psychological makeup, and part of what drove them to stick their finger down their throat, or to do any number of different things. One of the quotes that I've read recently in When the Body Says No is about how shame is the deepest of the so-called negative emotions.
Yeah.
And shame is a big theme in my show and in my life.
Right.
Why would that be the deepest of the negative emotions?
It's very interesting about shame. We always think that shame has to do with doing something wrong and then we're ashamed of it. But in fact, shame begins long before there's any idea of doing anything wrong. Shame is not primarily an emotion. It doesn't begin as an emotion. At least what it is really is an activation of a certain part of the nervous system called the parasympathetic nervous system, which basically makes everything go slack. So in a shame state, your neck falls, your head falls, your eyes look away, and you're like this. This is the shame state. Now you can induce shame in a 9-month-old baby who's got no concept of having done anything wrong. And how you induce shame, the shame reaction in an infant, is if the mother and infant are looking into each other's eyes and the mother looks away, the infant goes into a shame state. So shame primarily has to do with loss of contact with those that you need to be in contact with. Later on, the concept of you're losing contact because you did something wrong gets grafted into it, because parents sometimes have to shame their kids. Now, sometimes it's good that a kid should go slack. If a kid is about to jump off the kitchen table at age 2 or do something bad and you yell at them, don't do that, they relax, then they won't hurt themselves. But when you've done that, you've broken the contact between you and the kid. That's how you do it. Now, If then the parent goes on, instead of rebuilding that contact, or Gerhard Kaufman, who writes about shame very eloquently, he says, if the parent doesn't rebuild that interpersonal bridge that's just been broken, then the child begins to feel that there's something wrong with them inherently. So sometimes we have to shame our kids in a sense of a quick breakage of the relationship just in order to stop some unacceptable or dangerous behavior. But then if we make the kid believe that it's something wrong with them, then the shame state becomes ingrained, and that shame state is a state of isolation, which is, of course, the worst thing a human being can experience, because contact is the biggest need that we have. So shame goes back really a long way into pre-verbal days, and it's toxic. When you run into difficulties, and you very well might, because you might feel really lousy. I mean, it's not a experience that one does for the joyride. First of all, as TJ, I think, indicates in his play, it just tastes bloody awful. And secondly, you can get nausea and who knows what, you know. Diarrhea sometimes, that happens not so much, but that's just another way of purging. It usually comes out one end or the other. Sometimes, but anyway, so what I'm saying is you may not feel very good, and sometimes you might feel terror. And I've seen people experience sheer terror. The advice is that first you just try and stay with that and be curious about it. What is this about? Like a meditation, you know, like in a meditation, you don't try and make anything happen, you just observe whatever's going on with some curiosity. And ask the plant, well, what are you trying to tell me? What are you trying to show me here with this terror that I'm experiencing? What do I need to know here? And a lot of people, if they do that, they'll get through it. Now, however, if they're actually stuck with it and they're just not able to get past it and they really feel they need help, we're encouraging people to just say, I need help. And if they need help, then one of the ayahuasqueros will come over to them and will help them. Or one of the helpers will come over to help them physically if that's what they need. Sometimes a person just might need help to get up and go to the bathroom because they're a little bit off balance. That can happen. Or they might need more specific help to get to a very difficult, dark emotional state. And then, if they need to, at that moment, to talk, if they really have to get it out of themselves, then I'll go off with them and we'll just talk a little bit. So we encourage people to, as I say, be with the experience, but if they find that difficult or intolerable, they're really encouraged to seek help at that moment and to verbalize the need for help. If you find yourself in a difficult spot and you're really thinking you just can't make it on your own, or you just ask for help. And a lot of people do. And as TJ reveals in his play, he didn't. He had a very dark experience, but typically for him, he didn't ask for help. And usually, when people don't, it reflects how they live their lives. When stuff happens and we don't process it as kids because we don't get the support to process it, we get cut off from certain parts of ourselves. Then to become whole again, we have to reconnect. And that's what healing means to me. Now in this culture, for all kinds of reasons that I won't go into now, but for all kinds of reasons, very few children get the kind of support where they can really stay connected to themselves completely. So most people who grow up in this culture will have some healing to do. And as parents, yeah, we're going to, one way or another, create problems for our kids. That's not a tragedy. That's just how it is. And as a therapist once said to me, if your parents give you this much shit and you give your kids only this much, you've done a great job. So now, does everybody need to? There's no need here. Nobody's talking about need. We're talking about, do you as a person, and not as a parent now, but just as a person, find the areas in your life where you're not fully in touch with yourself, where you're not fully realized, where you're not fully expressed, where there's certain repeated patterns in your behavior that continue to cause you some degree of grief, and yet you don't know how to give them up? If the answer is yes to any of those questions, then I'd say there's room for healing should you wish to take that on. There's no need to take it on. You can lead a perfectly okay life without taking anything on. But that's just an individual decision. So I'm not saying certainly that you need to do anything. It's a question, is there something here that tells you that you could be getting more out of life, that you could be more alive in your life? And if the answer is yes, well then yeah, then the job of becoming whole is something that may engage you. And yeah, almost inevitably, again, in this culture, we tend to create some difficulties for our kids, and not because we don't love them, not because we don't do our best, but just because of the stressed nature of the society that we live in and the fact that we have stuff that we haven't fully resolved yet. There have been people who've had cancer who've come to my retreats, but I can't say that because they participated, the ayahuasca helped them experience remission. I believe that's highly likely and highly possible and even likely because of what I believe about cancer, which is that the cancer is really but basically when we suppress ourselves, when we suppress our emotions, we also suppress our immune systems because of the demonstrated unity between mind and body. You can't separate the two. So people that suppress anger also will suppress their immune systems. And so therefore when people can open, and so that the cancer comes along, and this is strange to say this, but I'm sure many of you have heard this yourselves, but I certainly have as a physician, that somebody with cancer, and sometimes even with terminal cancer, or some other terrible disease. Today I was leading a workshop for some addiction workers, and a woman comes up to me and tells me that she had something called Guillain-Barré disease, which is a paralyzing post-viral condition, very dangerous and could leave you paralyzed. And she said it was the best thing that ever happened to her. And people have said the same to me about cancer. So when you say, what are they talking about? How many of you heard such statement? How many of you have heard people say that kind of thing? Well, many of you have. And what they're talking about, of course, is that the experience of dealing with that disease connected them to themselves.
Made them whole.
Sorry?
Made them whole.
It made them whole, yeah. Not that the cancer did, but dealing with it did. Yeah, it made them whole. And so they're very grateful for that. So I think, and I've known people, not through ayahuasca, but people who've done other kind of spiritual work and so on, who've had amazing remissions, way beyond medical prognoses. Because if the cancer comes along to say no on your behalf when you didn't, if you learn how to say no, then the cancer says, okay, I don't need to hang around anymore. Now that's a simplistic way of putting it, but I think it can work that way, and I've seen many examples where it has. So I think that certainly ayahuasca or other psychedelic modalities can be powerfully used that way. The problem is, of course, it's impossible to study this in any systematic sense because it's not legal, and it's impossible to set up a clinical study with any of these substances. But I very much believe that could be used that way.
But there was a guy on the retreat that I was on who had ALS.
Yeah.
And after the second ceremony, he made the statement that he'd come to realize that saving his life wasn't about extending it.
Yeah, that's right. He said, he said, I want my life. And after the second ceremony, he said, I realize now that when I said I want my life, I thought that we should extend my life, but I mean now that I want to live while I'm alive. And he did, and he died 3 months ago. He came to us at a very late stage of ALS. But I think that potentially a lot of people could heal. I don't know that, but that's my impression. No, there are certain medications that are contraindicated. The SSRIs are contraindicated. Interestingly enough, by the way, I looked at that question recently because somebody very close to me wanted to do ayahuasca ceremonies, and he'd been taking an SSRI medication. And so I looked into that question very much, and theoretically there's a risk. I think in practice the risk is much less. And I won't go into the technicalities, but certainly for safety's sake, if somebody's going to come to my ceremonies, they're going to have to be off their SSRIs for a certain period of time. Look, I think that's the more broken things are, the more people want some kind of solution. We're living in a highly stressed society, and we're living in a highly medicated society. And people are necessarily seeing the limitations of mainstream medical practice. Not that it doesn't offer a lot of great stuff, but it's also in a very narrow range of perspective that it offers it. And just as a lot of people are seeking some meaning in spiritual work these days, a lot of people are also looking at medicinal modalities beyond the mainstream, just because of the recognition that things aren't working. So I think the interest in this stuff is a reflection of the failure, really, and sometimes a desperate failure of the mainstream medical system, and particularly the pharmacological approaches. And then, don't forget the spiritual aspect here. I mean, people have always looked for some ways of connecting, and of course, native traditions all around the world have always used plants. Here in North America, the peyote, the tobacco, alcoholic spirits in some areas, the mushrooms, in the Amazon, the ayahuasca and other plants, the San Pedro, in Africa, the ibogaine, or the iboga plant. So that, there's just more openness now for the reason that we live in a more global village, if you like. We're more aware of these things, and also we have more of a need for them. I never worry about those things too much. I just do what I do because I think it works, or it's useful, or I'm interested in it. And systemically, I don't see any big changes coming up, certainly not under this government. They had actually approved ayahuasca for religious purposes, in Canada. Health Canada went through an investigative process. They decided it wasn't addictive, it wasn't harmful, and that for religious purposes it should be approved. That was the recommendation of the expert staff. The minister just nixed that. And so I'm not looking for much change that way. There's an organization called MAPS. If you're interested in that kind of stuff, there's a group called MAPS, Multidisciplinary Association for the Study of Psychedelic Science. And MAPS is sponsoring a study that's going to be conducted here in British Columbia, in Vancouver, as it's being done elsewhere as well with MDMA and post-traumatic stress disorder. This has been approved by Health Canada because MAPS has the resources and the organization to get it through the... But that's much easier to do because MDMA is a dose-controllable specific entity. Ayahuasca is a drink that you can't measure, and you couldn't fit it into the clinical study box. So what I'm saying is that organizationally and professionally, there's a lot of people working on it. So I think what's going to happen, and if you look at the literature, there's more and more articles now on the value of psilocybin, mushroom, in end-of-life issues, in dealing with depression. So there's more and more professional literature. There's more and more literature on iboga, and its amazing capacity to help people detox from opiates in a day or two. Can you believe that? Somebody could be on heroin for 10 years. They do ibogaine once or twice. They don't have withdrawal symptoms. What we do is we put them on methadone for years, where we could actually get them off their opiates. So there's more and more literature, but I don't see much movement politically. So the question is, do we wait for the politicians to wake up, which ain't going to happen, not in my lifetime, or do we just carry on the work that we're able to do under such conditions that we can create for ourselves? And if you're in the health field, I would say the same thing might be true for you. Well, it seems to activate, this is a very simplistic explanation, and to tell you the truth, I keep reading the neurophysiology of it and I keep forgetting it. I don't really care. But it seems to activate two brain centers for sure. One of them are childhood memories are stored, deep emotional childhood memories are stored. And so whatever people are experiencing, whatever terror they're experiencing is actually, to me, explainable that it's a memory they're having. Not necessarily a memory of a specific event, but a memory of an emotional state that they experienced in childhood. So it triggers those circuits. But like with my daughter, it also enlivens circuits where insight is activated. So they're able to look at their childhood experiences with some adult insight. So they can, again, accompany themselves into some of the most difficult experiences of childhood. And by the way, some people have very joyful, blissful experiences, and it's not like it's uniformly dark for people, and it could be one night and another night. And you might have a blissful experience one night, and you think, oh my, great, I can hardly wait, and the next night you get really slammed, or vice versa, I don't know. But the point is that to be able to revisit those childhood places where you felt hurt and alone and scared, but to be able to accompany yourself to those places in a safe environment really is what the healing is about. So I think that's why it works. Now, the shamans or the ayahuasqueros we work with would add, well, the spirit of the plant is guiding you. You're getting guidance here from somebody higher than your little egoic self. So for them, there'd be that spiritual dimension as well. And some people have spiritual experiences. Well, actually, well, we always tell people that if you don't develop some kind of practice around it, it's just gonna be a memory, you know. And well, I can tell you how quickly that can happen. I was leading one of these retreats in British Columbia a couple of years ago, and you know, when I do these retreats, I really am on. I mean, I'm present, and the insights are coming, and I love how I am, you know, because who doesn't want to be that present, you know? So I thought, boy, I really got it. I finally got it, you know. So I come home and I take the Sky train home, or the home from the airport, and my wife picks me up at 25th and Cambie at the, is it Sky? What's it called? Sorry? Canada Line. Thanks. Yeah. And she just had a haircut that day, and I hated it, and I got depressed and gloomy, and life wasn't worth living. You know, this is how long it can last sometimes.
From a haircut.
Sorry?
From a haircut.
From a haircut, you know. I mean, talk about a bad haircut that could ruin your whole day, you know. So, you know, I mean, I don't want to, let's not romanticize these experiences. You know, they're important, and they can be very, very supportive in your life, but really only if you put in the work. And in TJ's case, he's got the good fortune of having the skill that he can actually create something around it and then share it with people. And so that for him, that's been the work. And every time he does it, it drives the insight and the state of being further and further into his consciousness.
It becomes harder to forget.
It becomes hard to forget, you know. But everybody's got to develop something around it, otherwise it just doesn't stick. But in terms of how you can hold on to the benefits of a ceremony or a retreat, is we tell people, well, meditate daily, which doesn't mean you're going to have to be good at it, just do it. Do 10 minutes a day where you're still and you're not doing anything else and you're not distracting yourself. It doesn't matter what happens in your mind. It could be distracted and go all over the place. Nevertheless, just be there with yourself. Journal. Spend just 5 minutes a day recalling and staying with an experience you had during the retreat. Talk with people stay in contact with people that are on a retreat with you. Ask them how they're doing. Share with them how you're doing. So any number of ongoing, you know, and then there are various exercises that I teach during the retreat that people can continue to do. But you got to do something. Otherwise, really, for many, many people, it just becomes a interesting memory.